This video is part of two videos all about disabled people. What's disability? What's Cinderella and her ugly sisters got to do with it? We've got lots to cover, so this video will be in two parts. This is part one. So disability, what is it? Well, how you define a social problem determines the type of solution you seek for that problem. So there's been a massive investment of time, energy and money to define disability, but we're still mostly confused about it. Naming disability is really tough. We can't even figure that out. There's lots of very confusing terminology in use, and that terminology is contested, transient and culturally specific. So, for example, what we label intellectual impairment in Australia is referred to in other countries as learning difficulty or learning disability or mental retardation. But we don't use that one anymore because the word retard has become a term of abuse. Now, we also have a variety of generic labels. The most common are people with disabilities, people with impairments, the differently abled, and disabled people. We also have different labels for people who are not disabled, such as the non-disabled and the able-bodied. So it's all really confusing. Now, a lot of people use the term people with disabilities, and often this is for apparent good reason. People explain that the person should come first, that we should see the person before we see the disability. But they're wrong. Sorry, but they're wrong. The better terminology is to use the term disabled people. If you want to be on the right side of the disability civil rights movement, say disabled people. Use the term disabled people. We'll talk about that more in part two when we get onto the social model. You might detect already that behind all of these different labels that there are hidden codes. The word disability is code for the medical model. The word impairment is code for either the medical model or the social model. And the word disabled is code for the social model. What's the medical model and social model of disability? Well, as I said, we're not going to talk about it yet. We're going to talk about that in part two. What a tease I am. We will get to it. It's really important to get to. But I just want to first answer the question of how many disabled people are there? Well, most social statistics on this are shaky. Bear in mind that we can't even define it properly yet. So it's hard to get definitive social statistics on it. But I'll give you some of the social statistics that are most often cited. So in Australia, it's believed that there are around 4 million disabled people. That's around 20% of the population, 1 in 5 of us. And this number is increasing, particularly as our population in Australia ages. Now, worldwide, there are around about 1 billion disabled people, which is around about 15% of the population of the world. Now, most of those disabled people live in economically disadvantaged societies, also called developing nations. Now, typically, you'll find the figure somewhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 5 being cited in most social statistics on disability. That's kind of the ballpark that you'll often see. Now, what is the problem? What is the problem about disability? Well, we get to that problem by asking the question of what do people think when they think about disabled people? Well, disabled people are generally seen as bad people in some way or another. Things are not as bad as they were, or disabled people aren't seen as bad as they used to be, but still, typically, when people think of disabled people, they think of something that's bad, something that's gone wrong with them, or is wrong with them. But this is only a recent cultural phenomenon. For most of human history, it appears disabled people weren't viewed as bad at all. They weren't seen as anything happening to them that was bad, or they weren't seen as bad people. In fact, they were kind of respected. Now, we go way back to Nandi, who was a Neanderthal man who had a congenital deformity. And archaeologists discovered him buried in a way that suggested he held considerable respect from his community. Now, we can be more recent than that. We can go to the early 1800s, and this was the time when the brothers Grimm were writing. They're writing all those lovely fairy stories, and they wrote a version of the fairy story Cinderella. The story of a beautiful young woman who marries her handsome prince despite the trickery and deceitfulness of her ugly, i.e. facially disfigured sisters. But the modern telling of the tale changes the significance of the ugly sisters that was contained in its original telling. In its original form, the ugly sisters actually disabled themselves. They self-mutilated. in order to appear more attractive to the prince. Now, in the times before Judeo-Christianity became the dominant ideology, disability was experienced as something sensual, exciting, and attractive. You know, the nature of the disability stories we tell in modern times recasts disability under a less benign light. So earlier societies rejoiced in difference and found pride in disability, kind of like Generation Z kind of look as though they're doing in some cultures right now. You know, the new generation that's coming along, going to be adults and take over our jobs. You know, the new generation is starting to show signs of this celebrating difference and diversity. So things might be swinging around to where they were back in kind of 1700s, 1800s. Now, in modern times, what we've seen is disability being portrayed in highly negative ways. And the Judeo-Christian Church and other organised religions have been charged with creating this negative view of disabled people. The medieval church controlled the masses through repression of sexuality, and this was achieved through the oppression and control of women, gay and lesbian people, and the oppression and denigration of disabled people. Now, the church wasn't wholly successful at marginalising disabled people. The example of the Cinderella story in the 1800s of telling the story of the ugly sisters who actually made themselves ugly. But when the aims of the church to suppress sexual expression, particularly suppress disabled people because they were seen to excite the sexual urges, the church couldn't do this on its own. But when it was joined by a change in the economic context, namely the first industrial revolution in the mid to late 1700s and the establishment of modern medicine in the early 1800s, those forces combined were unstoppable, and we underwent a strong shift in cultural perspective towards disabled people. At that point, disabled people became pathologized by medicine. Many became incarcerated because they weren't seen as able to work in the new workplaces, the big factories. And medicine came along and said, well, we're going to tell you what's wrong with them. There's something gone badly wrong with disabled people. And the church joining in saying, yeah, we think disabled people are bad too. Anyway, just a little aside. Did you know that children don't find abnormal appearance uncomfortable until the age of about 11? The conclusion from this leads us away from believing reactions towards disabilities are innate and towards realising they're created through our socialisation as children and later as adults. Our responses to disabled people are learned through our culture. Now, there are lots of examples in modern culture of the negative portrayal of disabled people. Though this is changing, it's a slow change, and it's largely through the efforts of the disability movement. But we still see negative portrayals of disabled people. Here's a quote that I like, that came from Shari Thura in a paper called Disability and Monstrosity. A look at literary distortions of handicapping conditions. That's the name of the paper. It was published in the journal Rehabilitation. God, I almost gave out a full APA reference there. Not sure if you can verbally format it, and is there such a thing as a verbal format? Anyway, so it's published in the journal Rehabilitation Literature, volume 41, number 1 to 2, page 12 to 15, I think. I've just got a fantastic memory. Published January, February 1980. Wow. It's as though I'm reading off a script or something. So here's the quote. Dr. Frankenstein's organ transplant and Dr. No's iron fist quite naturally generate a special propensity for monstrous behaviour. Of course, the symbolic properties of disabled people are not exclusively lurid, though they often are. The point is that physical deformity in literature and art is almost never unencumbered by the trappings of metaphor. There are almost no average or ordinary, by the way, physically aberrant characters. Yeah, things are changing. So we do have an increased presence of disabled contestants on game shows, though those tend to be disabled people who are aesthetically pleasing and visually apparent. It's obvious they're disabled because they're in a wheelchair, and they're also young and good looking, often. We're also seeing disabled people on talent shows, but here they take on the role of the super cripple. They somehow have some special superhuman abilities, like being virtuoso musician. They're rarely portrayed as just normal everyday people. There are exceptions, but generally there's still a weird representation of disabled people in our media. As I say, things are changing, but change has not been quick enough. There's a lot of negative cultural baggage we've been carrying around for about 200 years. That takes a while to shake off. Things like Captain Hook, who's an amputee, Sylvester the Cat and Elmer Fudd, speech impediments, and the Elephant Man, physical impairment, and Dr. Evil, facial impairment. Those are just a few examples of the representation of disability in our culture that are wholly negative. Often people barely notice this association, but it's a constant association between impairment with badness. That it kind of, it registers in people's psyche. There's this constant, metaphor. Disability is a metaphor for something that's bad or evil. Now, here are the common stereotypes about disabled people. One, they're homogenous. They're disabled. They're all the same. The other is that, something pitiful, that people suffer from a disability. People constantly talk about people suffering from depression. It makes you feel pitiful towards them. Pity towards them. They are pitiful. It invokes a moral discourse of charity. Also representations, stereotypes of disabled people being evil. The Bond villains. All the Bond villains had some sort of impairment. That's what made them nasty. The other stereotype is the super cripple. Stephen Hawking, or Dustin Hoffman's portrayal of Rain Man. Or we could have them as, extraordinarily brave and courageous. Like the guy Simon West, who got horribly burnt in the Falklands. That was a big thing in the UK, not so sure if you heard about it here. But, an extraordinarily brave individual who've gone through this horror in their lives. Also, the stereotype of them being innocent or asexual. This is particularly in relation to people who have an intellectual impairment, often just seen as like children. Commonly disabled people are seen as dependent, that we care for the disabled. Again, kind of like charity cases. And disability has been explained by some organized religions as divine punishment for sin. It's God's punishment. Disability is God's punishment. Now have a look for David Heavey's picture book, The Creatures That Time Forgot. It's an eye-opening book. Lots of pictures for those of you who are sick of books full of words. You do have to get used to books full of words. We are at university. Well, if you're enrolled in the unit, you are. But sometimes you're just sick of the words. It's a big picture book, but it's a beautiful picture book and extremely thought-provoking picture book, all about the representation of disabled people. Now, these uses of impairment to signify evil are all around us. Keep an eye out for them. It's embedded in our culture, and sometimes you'll not see things so easily described as good and evil. You instead get a sense of a different binary that's operating, where good is replaced with healthy and evil is replaced with sick. You might also notice two processes. One is the construction of the normal and then the raising of anxiety over the abnormal. Now, R.LUM.R wrote about these two types of anxiety that are aroused in people. One he calls existential anxiety and the other aesthetic anxiety. Existential anxiety is where we dread becoming disabled ourselves and are glad that we're not disabled. This is the sort of there but the grace of God response to disability. The second type of response is the aesthetic anxiety. This is where people are repelled by disability. It's typified in the "does she smell" kind of response to a disabled person. And aesthetic anxiety is very much a cultural problem and one that we need to tackle if we're going to protect and promote the rights of disabled people. It's often the one we don't face up to. A lot of the disability stuff is, well, it could happen to you, there but by the grace of God. Therefore, we need to treat disabled people with respect and dignity because it might be you one day. There's that side of it, but there's that aesthetic side of it. Actually, people find disabled people distasteful, and we need to tackle that, the aesthetic anxiety. Anyway, that's the end of part one. Lots going on there. So In part 2, we're going to look at some statistics showing the sort of discrimination faced by disabled people. We're going to look at what causes impairment, and then we're going to look at the social and medical models. And why people don't have disabilities, but they are disabled. And I'll explain why you should be talking about disabled people, not people with disabilities. Anyway, till then, ta-da.